Welcome. If you're looking to get up to speed quickly on important topics, you're in the right place.
Glad to be diving in.
Today we're digging into some pretty significant financial shifts happening over at the Department of Defense.
Right, and it seems largely driven by this Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, as it's called.
Exactly. We're looking at news reports covering contract cancellations, some pretty big ones actually, and also hints of, well, potentially much bigger budget adjustments planned.
So our mission, if you will,
Yeah.
is to sort of unpack what's happening.
Yeah, let's figure out the scope, the thinking behind it, and, what the knock-on effects might be.
Okay. Well, the first thing that jumps out is the scale of those initial cuts Secretary Hegseth announced.
The $5.1 billion figure.
That's the one. $5.1 billion in contract cancellations. Now, you hear that number and it sounds, well, massive.
It does sound like a lot of money.
It is, but we need a bit of perspective. The total defense budget is huge, around $850 billion.
Okay.
So these cuts, the $5.1 billion, it's actually just over, like 0.5% of that total budget, 0.58% roughly.
Right. So context is key. Now, looking closer at where that $5.1 billion is coming from, the reports break it down.
They do. It seems pretty concentrated.
Yeah, it looks like $1.8 billion from consulting contracts. Accenture, Deloitte are mentioned. Then $1.4 billion related to cloud IT services.
Right.
And another $500 million from Navy business process consulting.
So it really does look like DOGE is starting with areas maybe seen as overhead or support functions.
That seems like a fair assessment. Why do you think they'd target those areas first? Consulting, IT?
Well, often these kinds of contracts, while important, can sometimes be areas where, let's say, inefficiencies creep in, or maybe there's some redundancy.
Okay.
There could also be a view that maybe these services can be done cheaper, perhaps streamlined, or even brought in-house without, directly hitting troop readiness or weapon systems.
And the reports also mentioned about 11 specific contracts being cut related to things like DEI, climate initiatives, and COVID-19 response.
Yes, those were specifically called out as well. It suggests a focus on particular types of spending beyond just general consulting or IT.
Okay, so those are the initial cuts, but it sounds like DOG's influence might be, well, broader than just these cancellations.
That's where it gets interesting, yeah. We're seeing reports quoting a former senior Pentagon official.
The smashing everything quote.
Exactly. Describing DOG's approach not as careful targeted efficiency, but more like smashing everything.
That's quite a statement. What does that suggest about how DOGE is operating, potentially?
Well, language like that, it definitely raises questions. It hints at a possibly, let's say, less nuanced approach.
You mean maybe not fully appreciating the complexities?
Potentially. Smashing everything implies maybe a bit of a blunt instrument, which could risk disrupting things that are actually working well, in the rush to find savings.
And then there's this other angle emerging, concerns about potential conflicts of interest.
Ah, yes, there are reports mentioning Elon Musk's companies.
Right, like SpaceX. They already have significant Pentagon contracts.
And the speculation seems to be that under this kind of efficiency push, maybe those contracts could even grow.
How might that work? What's the dynamic there?
Well, you could imagine a scenario where if the focus shifts heavily towards, say, specific tech providers seen as delivering value or innovation efficiently.
Then companies already positioned like that might benefit disproportionately.
Potentially, yes. It could lead to more contracts flowing towards a smaller number of large players, and naturally that brings up questions about fair competition, level playing fields, and maybe undue influence.
Okay, but maybe the biggest piece of news here is the longer-term plan. Secretary Hegseth directing leaders to plan for, 8% cuts?
Annual 8% budget cuts. For the next 5 years. That's a really significant target. It suggests a potentially massive reshaping of the defense budget over time.
8% a year for 5 years.
Wow. It's very ambitious, yes. Sustained cuts like that are hard to achieve, but, and this is crucial, certain areas are apparently off limits.
Exemptions, like what?
The reporting indicates exemptions for border operations.
Okay.
Modernizing nuclear weapons.
Right.
And acquiring submarines and drones.
So those exemptions tell us a lot about priorities, don't they?
They absolutely do. It paints a clear picture of where this administration sees the most critical investments versus where they think or hope they can make cuts.
So if you connect the dots, the initial cuts in consulting and IT, this potentially aggressive DOGE approach, and then these huge future targets except for those specific areas.
It really makes you wonder where the bulk of those future 8% annual cuts are expected to come from.
It implies a much deeper dive into other programs, maybe personnel, other sectors of the military that aren't on that exempt list.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the listener. Thinking about this, if you're aiming for such big savings through broad cuts, but you're protecting these specific high priority zones.
Where's the impact going to land? Which parts of the DoD might feel the squeeze the most?
That's the critical question, isn't it?
So let's just quickly recap. We've got these initial $5.1 billion contract cancellations, mostly hitting consulting and IT.
Yep, along with some specific program cuts like DEI.
Then there's this debate swirling around DOGE's methods efficient or just disruptive, and some background noise about potential conflicts of interest.
Right, it's a SpaceX angle.
And looming over it all, this plan for substantial multi-year budget cuts, but with key strategic areas like nukes, subs, drones, and border ops shielded.
Precisely. Which leads to a final thought maybe for everyone listening to consider.
Go ahead.
Well, given the sheer size of the defense budget and these very deliberate choices about where to cut and where to spend or protect, what does that tell us? What does it suggest about the threats and the strategic priorities that are really shaping the DoD's future right now?
Thinking about what's being prioritized versus what's being cut as a signal of future direction.
Exactly. It's definitely worth pondering the longer-term consequences of these efficiency drives and what they signal about defense strategy moving forward.